Americans to have that international cooperative effort and so forth. This was truly the last Apollo mission. Apollo 17 was the last ship to go up unilaterally, but we did consider this mission with the Soviets as part of the Apollo mission. It was primarily symbolic, and the amount of information that we got did not really compare in regards to some of the other solo U.S. missions. The purpose was a joint international effort. When the Soviets and Americans got together, they conducted joint scientific experiments, they exchanged flags and gifts, signed certificates, they visited each other's ships, ate together, conversed in each other's languages, which, again, considering what the level of antagonism between the two countries is pretty symbolic. Here's a picture of the handshake. It's not as great as I would like. The handshake is right here. Okay. They didn't have our cool Android cell phones up in space to take great images. So that picture is much cleaner when it's not blown up. So it's actually a fairly clear picture. 1980s already. Actually, the 1980s was a pretty important. There's a lot going on in the 1980s. I wouldn't say in comparison to the 1970s. But in the 1970s, the United States really put in a lot of resource power into creating that shuttle fleet. And so we didn't have a lot of launches. We had some of the finishing up the Apollo project and so forth. But it wasn't until 1981 that Nixon vision of that space shuttle fleet we talked about actually occurred. And it started with the Shuttle Columbia. Remember we mentioned the Shuttle Enterprise, which was rolled out in the 1970s, but that was just a test. And that didn't actually launch. Shuttle Columbia was the first. It was launched on April 12, 1981, and it's the first space shuttle flight, part of that vision that Nixon talked about in 1972. So it becomes the first winged spaceship to orbit Earth and return to airport landing. So return to airport landing. Interesting enough, this was launched on the 20th anniversary of Vostok 1. So the 20th anniversary of Vostok 1, which was what again? What was Vostok 1? First human in space, right? Gregarian, very good. And this returned on April 14th, 1981. So it wasn't up for long. And it orbited the Earth 36 times. Let's talk briefly about our space shuttle program here. Certainly we're going to talk more about it when we talk about specific space shuttle launches here momentarily. But overall, the space shuttle program has had a lot of successes. We'll talk about the Hubble Space Telescope. We'll talk about the carrying of modules for the International Space Station soon. But the space shuttles, the overall mission did not meet Nixon's vision. We didn't do nearly all that Nixon had envisioned, and nearly all by the time Nixon would have liked us to. The shuttle fleet was originally designed to perform 580 missions over its first 12 years. So the original design was to have 580 missions. In its first 12 years, that cost us $16 billion. Due to cost overruns, like not enough money and design difficulties, there were only 110 shuttle flights over that 12-year period. So originally they wanted 580, we only got 110. And those 110 cost $85 billion. So the original plan is 580 missions with $16 billion. We only got 110 missions at $85 billion. Quite a difference. Okay. Of the 5 working space shuttles, 2, the Challenger and Columbia, which we'll talk about its tragedy here in a minute, were lost in accidents. And the other 3, so it's important to note, are Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. So there were 5 working space shuttles. 2 we've lost in the accidents, the Challenger and the Columbia. The other 3 are Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. Current space shuttle missions cost $1 billion a flight. Current space shuttle missions cost $1 billion a flight. That's $1 billion a flight. And the space shuttle fleet is now being retired, and we'll talk more about that later. That's kind of, if you are, interested in outer space, that's what's dominating the news right now, at least the past few months, is the retiring of the space shuttle program. Yes? So how much was it for each mission cost? $1 billion. Sorry, I did a picture of the Space Shuttle Columbia, and we will talk about Columbia here again momentarily. There's a picture of Space Shuttle Columbia, so the first Space Shuttle flight in 1981 was on Columbia. Important to note, she's gained a lot of notoriety and credibility. Sally Ride was the first U.S. female in space. She was not the first woman in space. There were 2 Soviet females that were ahead of Sally Ride, but her mission into outer space as the first U.S. female certainly gave her a lot of fame and notoriety here in the United States. She was on board the Challenger mission -STS-7 on June 18, 1983. She was the first woman ever to use the robot arm in space, and the first to use that arm to retrieve a satellite. This also gets lost in kind of the generation. She was also the youngest person at the time to ever be in space, the youngest American to ever be in space at the time, back in 1983, when she was launched, first American woman, and the youngest American ever to launch in space. She has spent more than a total of, in her career, more than 343 hours in space. So not just the first U.S. female in space, but a very key astronaut in our program. I do have a short video on Sally Ride.
Carried huge expectations along with it, and that was made pretty clear just the day that I was told I was selected to the crew, because I was also taken up to Chris Kraft's office, who's the head of the Johnson Space Center, because he wanted to have a little chat with me and make sure that I knew what I was getting into before I agreed to be on the crew. But I was so dazzled just by the opportunity to be on the crew and go into space that I really don't remember very much of what he said. On launch day, there was so much excitement and so much happening around us in the crew quarters, even on the way to the launch pad, going up the launch pad, looking up and seeing, this huge, rocket that kind of sounds like an animal. You can kind of hear the gurgling and the hissing, and, it sounds like it's alive. I spent an enormous amount of effort just trying to stay focused. I tried to block out pretty much everything that was going on around me and just kind of put one foot in front of the other, because it would have been way too easy to just be lost in the moment. I didn't really think about it that much at the time, because I just wanted to get the opportunity to do that. But I came to appreciate what an honor it was to be selected to be the first woman to get a chance to go into space.
I chose that video not just to commemorate Sally Ride, but I think it also, again, with all the facts and the history, we kind of lose, I think, some of the awesomeness of what it would be like to actually be an astronaut heading into that space shuttle, heading into space. I thought she did a good job of depicting that. Going on in the 1980s, I think it's important to talk really quickly about the first untethered spacewalk by Bruce McClandis in February 7th, 1984. He used the device called the Manned Maneuvering Unit. So you could actually walk around or be in space untethered. Okay. We do have a picture of that, but I'll make sure y'all get that down. This picture seems so, I don't know, it almost seems unreal to me. I don't know, hopefully when it's blown up it looks as clear as it does. But this looks like something that would be on the back of your iPhone or something like that. Just a very, but real photo. Bruce McClandis walking in space. Here's a fun fact about space. If you shouted in space to someone right next to you, they wouldn't be able to hear you. Okay? The ability of that sound travel, if you shouted in space to the person right next to you, they would not be able to hear you. probably the only way I would ever be considered quiet in a freelancer. The Moon Treaty, we're going to talk real quickly about this. In actuality, folks, this treaty doesn't do much for us right now because there are very few countries that have ratified the Moon Treaty, but I think it may come up in some debate, so that's why I put it in there. It went into force in 1984. Okay, the language that was actually finalized back in 1979. The treaty was written, drafted, and finalized in 1979. It went into force in 1984. It intended to establish a regime for the use of the moon. Very similar to the United Nations Treaty on like the law of the sea, on how we govern the oceans. Okay? But as you can see at the bottom, very few countries have actually become a member of this. There's actually only 13 states that have ratified it. And these are not big space players. Australia, Austria, Belgium, Chile, Kazakhstan, Lebanon, Mexico, Morocco, Netherlands, Pakistan, Peru, Philippines, and Uruguay. They've agreed to the Moon Provision Treaties and have ratified it. France, Guatemala, India, and Romania have signed it but have not ratified it yet. The United States has not even signed it. Okay? A lot of times they have treaties kind of sitting in limbo. The president signed it and needs Senate ratification. The president hasn't even signed it yet. So the idea is that the moon should be the benefit of the entire international community. It expresses the desire to prevent the moon from becoming a source of international conflict. It bans the military use of the moon, requires that the Secretary General of the United Nations be notified of all celestial activities. It bans altering the environment of these celestial bodies. And it states if they are researching on these celestial bodies, have to prevent accidental contamination. Okay? But again, it really does not have a lot of legal standing now because so few countries have ratified it, are parties to it. Here's a map. The countries in green are parties to it. The countries in yellow have signed but not ratified. So again, certainly none of the big space players are parties to it. The only major spacefaring player, India, is in yellow, which means they're not an official party to it. They've signed it but not ratified it. But I think that the Moon Treaty may be discussed in some debate this year, so I thought it was important to bring it up. 1980s, the Challenger tragedy. We talked about Apollo 1. Okay, this happened January 28, 1986. It's the first NASA accident to actually happen after launch. Remember, the Apollo 1 was on the test pad. It exploded 73 seconds after takeoff. And all 7 astronauts on board were killed. We are going to watch a video about this. We are going to watch the video of the Challenger exploding. It is haunting, so I do want to prepare you for that. What made this event even more tragic than obviously the loss of 7 lives is that this was the first time that a non-astronaut, for lack of a better term, was up in space. A teacher by the name of Kristen McCullough was on board. She actually won a contest from teachers all across the nation to be on board of the Space Shuttle Challenger. She was chosen, trained at NASA for months, and then was on board with this. This Space Shuttle launch was watched by millions across the country and a lot of school children. And obviously, watching this not knowing that it was going to end in tragedy. And so a lot of people, when you talk about times in your life, like where were people when Kennedy was assassinated, where were you when 9/11 occurred, this is included for people that were alive during 1986. Where were you when the Space Shuttle exploded? I was in first or 6th grade social studies class in the library watching this live, like millions of school children all over. It is believed that the separation of the O-ring, and again, I'm not an engineer, was the reason why it exploded. The O-ring is a seal, and I would not be able to even draw a picture of you what this meant. In its right solid rocket booster, and that seal failed after liftoff. Okay? And it allowed for pressurized hot gas to get into the external fuel tank. Most of the crew compartments and many other vehicle fragments were eventually recovered from the ocean. It is not known whether or not their initially reports were that the astronauts died immediately. There's been some discussion that some may have survived the initial breakup of the spacecraft and actually tried to maneuver the part of the compartment that was left.